The morning sun cast long shadows across the drought-cracked earth as Elias Turner loaded the last of his possessions onto his weathered wagon. The once proud ranch that had belonged to his family for 3 generations now belonged to the bank, and the foreclosure notice, still crumpled in his shirt pocket, felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. "You sure about this, Elias?" called out Samuel Mackenzie from across the dusty main street of Cedar Flats. The store owner's voice carried both concern and doubt. That Rivers claimed more lives than the cholera outbreak of '78. Elias adjusted his worn hat, the brim frayed from years of honest work under the relentless Texas sun. At 32, he looked older. Lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting against dust storms and worry. His calloused hands gripped the wagon's side as he turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. "Don't have much choice, Sam," Elias replied, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach. "Got word there's good land on the other side. Free land for those willing to work it." Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, shook her head disapprovingly. "Free land won't do you any good if you're dead at the bottom of the sacred river. That water's been running high and angry ever since the spring storms hit the mountains." The sacred river had earned its name not from any divine blessing, but from the respect and fear it commanded from everyone in the territory. Fed by mountain snowmelt and unpredictable storm runoff, its currents could shift from deceptively calm to raging torrent within hours. The locals had built their settlement deliberately on the eastern bank, content to let the western territories remain wild and unclaimed. Elias had spent sleepless nights studying maps and talking to the few travelers brave enough to venture near the crossing points. Every story ended the same way. Men with money and proper equipment sometimes made it across. Poor men, desperate men, men like him, they became cautionary tales. "The Hendersons' boy tried it last spring," whispered Agnes Porter to her daughter, loud enough for Elias to hear. "They found his body 3 miles downstream, caught up in the cottonwoods." The weight of their stares pressed down on Elias like the oppressive heat that had killed his crops. These people had watched him struggle through 2 failed harvests, had seen him sell off his livestock piece by piece, had witnessed the slow dissolution of everything his father and grandfather had built. Now they were watching what they believed would be his final act of desperation. "I appreciate your concern, folks," Elias said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "But sometimes a man's got to risk everything to save what little he's got left." The wagon wheels creaked as he urged his 2 remaining horses, Buck and Bell, faithful animals that had pulled plows through his best and worst seasons, toward the river road. Behind him, Cedar Flats grew smaller, its collection of weathered buildings and dust-covered dreams fading into the heat shimmer. The journey to the sacred river took most of the day. As Elias traveled, the landscape began to change subtly. The flat, arid plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak. The air carried different scents: water, rich earth, and something wild that spoke of untamed spaces beyond the reach of civilization. Late afternoon found him at the river's edge, and the sight stole his breath. The sacred river stretched before him like a liquid barrier between worlds, its surface deceptively smooth, but betraying the power beneath with occasional whirlpools and the constant low rumble of fast-moving water over hidden rocks. On the far bank, maybe 200 yards away, Elias could see green grass, actual green grass, not the brown stubble that had become his reality. Trees grew thick and tall, their leaves rustling with health and abundance. It might as well have been another country, another life entirely. He made camp as the sun began its descent, knowing better than to attempt a river crossing in darkness. The horses grazed on what sparse grass they could find, while Elias sat by his small fire, studying the water and trying to calculate currents, depths, and possibilities. That's when he noticed he wasn't alone. Across the river, barely visible in the gathering dusk, a figure sat motionless on horseback. At first, Elias thought it might be his imagination, a trick of failing light and anxious hope. But as full darkness fell and his eyes adjusted, he could make out the silhouette clearly. Someone was watching him, had been watching him, with the patience of a hunter or a guardian. The figure never moved, never called out, simply maintained its vigil through the long hours of the night. Elias found the presence oddly comforting rather than threatening. In a land where he'd felt increasingly alone and unwanted, knowing that someone, anyone, was aware of his existence felt like a small mercy. When dawn broke grey and cool over the water, Elias woke to find the mysterious watcher gone. But something had changed in the night. The river, which had seemed impossibly wild and dangerous in daylight, now appeared different, still formidable, but perhaps not quite as insurmountable. He spent the morning checking and double-checking his wagon, securing every item that could be secured, waterproofing what could be waterproofed. Buck and Bell seemed to sense his nervousness, stamping and whickering as he examined their harnesses for the 100th time. By midday, with the sun high and bright, Elias could delay no longer. He'd studied the water, picked what seemed like the safest crossing point, and said every prayer he could remember from childhood Sunday services. "Well, boys," he said to the horses, his voice rougher than usual, "let's see if a turner can beat the odds one more time." He guided the wagon into the shallows, feeling the immediate tug of current against the wheels. Buck and Bell entered reluctantly, their instincts warning them of danger, but their trust in Elias overriding their fear. For the first 50 yards, everything went according to plan. The water rose gradually, reaching the wagon's axles, then its bed, but the horses kept their footing and the current, while strong, remained manageable. Then they hit the main channel. The wagon lurched sideways as hidden currents grabbed it like invisible hands. Belle stumbled, regained her footing, stumbled again. The water, now chest-deep on the horses, began pouring over the wagon's sides, despite Elias's careful preparation. "Come on," Elias shouted, snapping the reins, his voice nearly lost in the river's roar. "Come on, we can make it." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the wagon beginning to float, felt control slipping away like water through his fingers. The horses were swimming now rather than walking, their powerful strokes fighting against a current that seemed determined to sweep them all downstream toward the rocks and rapids that had claimed so many others. Elias felt the wagon shift, felt it beginning to tip, and in that moment of crystalline terror, he understood why they called this the sacred river. It demanded respect, demanded sacrifice, and it rarely showed mercy to those who challenged its authority unprepared. The last thing he remembered clearly was the cold shock of water closing over his head and the desperate fading sound of Buck and Bell's frightened neighing as they fought their own battle against the merciless current. Consciousness returned to Elias like sunrise, slowly, then all at once. The first thing he became aware of was warmth. The heat of flames against his skin, the rough wool of a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The second was the fact that he was alive, which seemed impossible given his last clear memory of drowning in the sacred river. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on soft grass beside a crackling fire, with the most remarkable woman he'd ever seen sitting cross-legged nearby, tending to something cooking in a small pot. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with long black hair braided with small feathers and beads that caught the firelight. Her skin was bronzed by sun and wind, and she wore practical leather clothing that spoke of someone equally at home in wilderness and civilization. But it was her eyes that held Elias's attention, dark, intelligent, and filled with a kind of quiet strength that seemed to radiate outward like heat from the fire. "You're awake," she said simply, her English clear but accented with the musical cadence of her native tongue. "Good! I was beginning to worry you'd taken in too much river water." Elias tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as his head spun and his stomach clenched. "My horses," he managed to croak. "Buck and Bell, are they safe?" the woman assured him, nodding toward a grove of trees where Elias could make out the familiar shapes of his animals, grazing peacefully. Your wagon is mostly intact as well, though you'll need to dry out your supplies and check for damage. Relief flooded through him so completely that for a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice again, it came out as barely more than a whisper. How? The woman ladled something that smelled wonderfully of herbs and meat into a wooden bowl and offered it to him. My name is Ayana. I saw you attempting the crossing and realized you were in trouble. The current caught you about where I expected it would. Elias accepted the bowl gratefully, the warmth seeping through his chilled fingers. You expected it? The river has moods, Ayana explained matter-of-factly. Spring runoff makes it angry and unpredictable. Most people who try to cross during high water either don't know this or don't respect it. You had the knowledge but not the experience. As feeling returned to his body and the food warmed him from the inside, Elias began to piece together what must have happened. You saved me. You pulled me out. Ayana's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested the rescue had been neither simple nor easy. You and your animals. The river was trying to take you downstream to the rapids. I couldn't let that happen. Why? The question came out more bluntly than Elias intended. I mean, you don't know me. For all you knew, I could have been a troublemaker or worse. For the first time, Ayana smiled, a brief, brilliant expression that transformed her entire face. My grandmother taught me that the river tests people. It doesn't care about the color of their skin or the weight of their purse. It tests courage, determination, and heart. You had enough of all three to attempt the crossing when most would have turned back. That told me what I needed to know about you. Elias felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. I was desperate. Desperation isn't the same as courage. Isn't it? Ayana challenged gently. You lost everything, and instead of giving up, you loaded what little you had left and headed toward the unknown. You could have stayed in your settlement, found some way to survive on the charity of others. Instead, you chose to risk everything for the chance at something better. That's not desperation. That's hope. And hope takes tremendous courage. They ate in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Elias found himself studying Ayana when he thought she wasn't looking, trying to understand this woman who spoke of rivers having moods and grandmothers who taught life lessons, who had risked her own safety to save a stranger. Your people, he said finally. They live on this side of the river. Ayana nodded. There's a valley about 10 miles north of here. Good hunting, clean water, protected from the worst of the winter storms. My people have lived there for more generations than anyone remembers. And they're okay with you helping outsiders? From what I've heard, there's not much love lost between the tribes and the settlers. Ayana's expression grew more serious. There are wounds on both sides, she acknowledged. Broken promises, misunderstandings, fear. But my grandmother always said that healing begins when someone chooses to see the person instead of the enemy. Today, I chose to see a man who needed help. As darkness settled around their small camp, Elias found himself facing a question he hadn't expected. What now? His original plan had been simple: cross the river, find land, start over. But the reality was more complicated. He was alive because of this woman's intervention, in debt to her in a way that couldn't be repaid with money he didn't have. More than that, though, he found himself reluctant to leave, not just because Ayana had saved his life, but because in the few hours he'd known her, she'd shown him more kindness and understanding than he'd received from his own neighbors in months. There was something about her presence that made him feel less alone in the world. The land you're looking for, Ayana said, as if reading his thoughts. It's real. Good soil, plenty of water, game in the forests. But it's not unoccupied. Other settlers have tried to claim it, and there've been conflicts with my people. Elias felt his heart sink. So even if I made it across, I'd just be walking into more trouble. Maybe, Ayana said thoughtfully, or maybe there's another way. She stood and walked to the edge of their firelight, gazing out across the dark water toward the eastern shore, where Elias had started his journey. When she turned back, her expression was resolute in a way that reminded him of his grandmother, making one of her pronouncements that would reshape the family's entire future. "What if," she said slowly, "instead of taking land that belongs to others, you found a way to work with them? What if crossing this river meant more than just getting from one side to the other?" Elias set down his empty bowl, sensing that they were approaching something important. "What are you suggesting?" "My people know this land better than anyone. We know where the best soil lies, where the streams run cleanest, where the game is most plentiful. But we've also learned that the world is changing. More settlers are coming whether we want them or not. Maybe it's time to try something different than fighting or hiding." Ayanna sat back down across the fire from him, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing a vision that had been taking shape in her mind for a long time. "What if there was a place where both peoples could live, where your farming knowledge and our understanding of the land could work together instead of against each other? What if crossing this river could be the beginning of something new instead of just another conquest?" The idea was so unexpected, so different from anything Elias had ever considered, that he could only stare at her. In his world, you either won or lost, took or were taken from. The concept of genuine partnership between settlers and natives was as foreign as the idea of taming a tornado. But as he looked at Ayanna, saw the hope and determination in her eyes, he began to understand that she wasn't just talking about land or farming or survival. She was talking about the possibility of building something better than what either of their peoples had managed to create separately. "Your people would never accept it," he said finally. "Neither would mine." Ayanna smiled that brilliant smile again, but this time it held an edge of challenge that reminded him she'd called herself a warrior. "Then I guess we'll have to change their minds, won't we?" 3 months after his near drowning in the sacred river, Elias Turner stood in the middle of the most productive farmland he'd ever seen, watching Ayanna demonstrate the proper way to plant corn in partnership with beans and squash, what her people called the 3 sisters. "The corn gives the beans something to climb," she explained, her hands sure and steady as she worked the rich soil. "The beans give the corn and squash the nutrients they need. The squash spreads out and keeps weeds away while holding moisture in the ground. Each plant helps the others grow stronger." Elias nodded, though he was still getting used to farming methods that seemed to work with nature instead of against it. Back in Cedar Flats, farming had always felt like a war, against drought, against pests, against soil that seemed determined to blow away in the first strong wind. Here, guided by techniques Ayanna's people had perfected over generations, the land seemed eager to cooperate. "It's not just about the plants, is it?" he said, straightening up and wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're talking about people too." Ayanna's smile was answer enough. Over the past months, what had started as a desperate river crossing had evolved into something neither of them had expected. A genuine partnership that was slowly, carefully expanding to include others. The first breakthrough had come when Elias proved he could fix the broken wheel on a wagon belonging to Ayanna's cousin, Running Wolf. Word spread through the native community that the white farmer who'd nearly drowned in the sacred river had skills that were genuinely useful, and more importantly, that he treated people with respect regardless of their skin color. The second breakthrough came when a late spring storm threatened the crops of both communities. Elias had ridden hard through dangerous weather to warn Ayanna's people about a flash flood heading downstream, probably saving a dozen lives. After that, he wasn't just the white farmer anymore. He was Elias who rides through storms for his neighbors. But the real transformation had begun when Sarah Mackenzie, Samuel's daughter, had crossed the river. Sarah was 19, smart as a whip, and frustrated beyond measure by the limited opportunities available to young women in Cedar Flats. When she heard rumors that there was good land on the western side of the sacred river, and more importantly, that Elias Turner was not only alive, but apparently thriving, she'd made a decision that shocked her family and half the town. She'd convinced her father to let her cross the river, properly with a guide and adequate supplies, to see for herself what opportunities might exist in the Western Territories. Samuel had agreed mainly because he thought the reality of frontier life would send his daughter running back to the safety of civilization within a week. Instead, Sarah had taken one look at the thriving partnership between Elias and Ayana's people and seen possibilities that neither of them had fully recognized. "You're thinking too small," she'd announced after her first week in the valley. "This isn't just about farming, or even about cooperation between two communities. This could be about creating an entirely new kind of settlement, one that actually works." Now, as Elias watched Sarah teaching Ayana's younger sister the fundamentals of bookkeeping, while Ayana taught Sarah's friend Martha the secrets of natural medicine, he was beginning to understand what she'd meant. Elias. Running Wolf's voice interrupted his thoughts. The warrior approached with his characteristic blend of caution and curiosity, an attitude that had become typical of how Ayana's people viewed their unexpected partnership with the settlers. "There are riders approaching from the east. Many riders." Elias felt his stomach drop. They'd all known this day would come eventually. Word of their success had been spreading on both sides of the river, carried by traders and travelers who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Some of the reports were favorable, stories of cooperation and prosperity that challenged assumptions about what was possible between different peoples. Others were less positive. There were those in Cedar Flats who viewed Elias as a traitor to his own kind, and those among the native communities who saw Ayana's openness to settlers as dangerous naivety. Both groups had been growing more vocal in their opposition as the partnership proved successful. "How many?" Elias asked, already moving toward his horse. 15, maybe 20, armed but riding under a flag of truce." Ayana appeared at Elias's side, her face calm but alert. Over the months, they developed an instinctive coordination that served them well in moments like this. "Do you recognize any of them?" Running Wolf nodded grimly. "Samuel Mackenzie leads them, and Thomas Henderson is with him." Henderson, the banker who'd foreclosed on Elias's ranch. If he was here, it meant the delegation represented official business interests, not just concerned families. "They'll want to talk," Ayana said thoughtfully. "The question is whether they're here to negotiate or to issue ultimatums." Elias checked his rifle, more out of habit than expectation of trouble. Only one way to find out. The delegation arrived at midday, their horses lathered from hard riding and their faces grim with purpose. Samuel Mackenzie, looking older and more careworn than Elias remembered, dismounted and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Elias," he said simply, "Miss Ayana, we need to talk." What followed was the most important conversation of Elias's life. The delegation, it turned out, represented not just Cedar Flats, but several other settlements on the eastern side of the sacred river. Their communities were struggling. Drought, failed crops, economic depression, and a growing sense that the frontier dream was becoming a frontier nightmare. Meanwhile, reports of the success on the western side had been filtering back for months. Stories of abundant harvests, peaceful cooperation, and genuine prosperity had reached the ears of people who were desperate for hope. "We want to know if what we're hearing is true," Henderson said bluntly. "And if it is, we want to know if there's room for others." The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days and required all of Ayana's diplomatic skills, all of Elias's practical knowledge, and all of Sarah's bookkeeping expertise. There were moments when it seemed like the discussions would break down entirely. Too much history, too much mistrust, too many competing interests. But gradually, painfully, Honestly, they worked out the framework for something unprecedented, a genuine partnership between the settlements on both sides of the sacred river. The native communities would maintain their traditional lands and hunting grounds, but would share knowledge of sustainable farming and land management. The settler communities would contribute their skills in construction, manufacturing, and trade, but would agree to work within the ecological limits that Ayana's people understood so well. Most importantly, both sides would acknowledge that the sacred river wasn't a barrier to be overcome, but a resource to be shared and protected. "It won't be easy," Ayana warned as they finalized the agreements. "There will be people on both sides who oppose this. There will be misunderstandings, conflicts, failures." Samuel Mackenzie, who had surprised everyone by becoming one of the strongest advocates for the partnership, nodded soberly. "Nothing worthwhile ever is easy, but I've watched my community slowly dying for 5 years. If this gives us a chance at something better, it's worth the risk." As the delegation prepared to return to Cedar Flats with the proposal, Elias found himself standing once again at the edge of the sacred river. But this time, instead of seeing an impossible barrier, he saw a bridge, not just between two pieces of land, but between two ways of life. Ayana joined him, slipping her hand into his, with the comfortable ease that had developed between them over months of shared work and mutual respect. "Think they'll accept it?" she asked, watching the riders disappear into the eastern distance. "Some will," Elias said, "others won't. But enough will, I think. Enough to make a start. And if they don't?" Elias turned to look at the thriving community they'd built together, settlers and natives working side by side, children playing games that mixed both cultures, crops growing in patterns that honored both traditional knowledge and practical innovation. "Then we keep building anyway," he said simply. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is prove something's possible, even if not everyone's ready to believe it yet." 6 months later, as the first of the new families crossed the sacred river with proper guides and adequate supplies, Elias reflected on how much his life had changed since that desperate morning when he'd loaded his wagon and headed west. He'd set out looking for land and found something much more valuable: purpose, community, and love. The river still ran swift and dangerous, still demanded respect from anyone who tried to cross it. But it no longer separated worlds. It connected them, carrying not just water, but hope from the mountains to the sea, reminding everyone who saw it that some barriers existed only in the mind, and that the most sacred crossings were often the ones that brought people together instead of driving them apart. Standing on the bank where he'd almost died, watching children from both communities play together in the shallows, Elias Turner understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't trying to cross a river alone. It's building bridges strong enough for others to follow.